Let's spend some time talking about TANs during this part of the slides. A transnational advocacy network connects activists across national borders. One of the most important tools is naming and shaming. A government may be able to suppress a domestic group fairly easily, but suppose that group gets the attention of international NGOs, journalists, foreign governments, celebrities, and millions of people on social media. Suddenly, that government's behavior becomes much more visible. This is sometimes called the boomerang model. Domestic activists can get their own government to listen, so they reach outward to international allies. Those international allies then apply pressure back onto the government. Think of this like throwing a boomerang around a blocked domestic policy. Social media has made this even more faster. India provides an example. In 2021, a large number of farmers protested agricultural reforms. Their concerns didn't receive much attention within India. Khalsa Aid, an international NGO based in the United Kingdom, helped amplify those issues internationally. That's the TAN model in action. The important point isn't whether we agree with the farmers or the government. The important point is how political change happens when domestic actors gain international allies. A group that might have limited leverage inside one country can suddenly gain an international audience. Guantanamo Bay gives us another example. Following the September 11th attacks, the United States detained suspected terrorists at Guantanamo Bay. Human rights organizations raised serious concerns about interrogation practices and due process. This example is important because it shows that human rights debates aren't simply about democracies criticizing dictatorships. Democratic governments are also face international criticism. And again, we see the tension between security and rights. Governments facing security threats often argue that extraordinary circumstances require extraordinary measures. Human rights advocates worry that this logic can make supposed universal rights disappear precisely when they are the most vulnerable. One of the most important innovations in international human rights is the guiding principles of business and human rights, a first effort to hold international firms accountable for the human rights practices of the countries in which they operate. Linking materials to human rights is critical. Sometimes you can attach human rights to something governments care materially about, which is trade. Imagine telling a government if you want access to this trade agreement or economic benefit, you must meet certain human rights standards. Now, respecting human rights has a material payoff. The broader strategy is straightforward. If moral pressure isn't enough, by changing the cost benefit analysis, we can see differences. How can we hold states accountable? Now we shift the pressure to accountability. There are several mechanisms. We have the International Criminal Court, we have human rights treaties, we have transitional justice, and in some cases, individuals can directly petition international institutions. The important change here is that individuals increasingly have some ability to seek protections beyond their own government. Historically, international law was overwhelmingly about relationships between states. Human rights law now is increasingly focused on the treatment of individual people and international concerns. That's a major change. This is an image of Thomas Diallo, who is the first person to be convicted by the ICC. The International Criminal Court takes the idea even further about accountability. The ICC prosecutes individuals. the word is important. Political leaders cannot necessarily hide behind the argument, I was acting on behalf of the state. The court can hold particular people responsible. The ICC has had some success, but its record is mixed. Research suggests that the possibility of prosecution can deter some abuses, but there are some unintended consequences. Individuals who may be dictators fighting a civil war, they and they may consider that they are losing power, could uh, realize that prosecution by the Hague could come next. So, what incentive do they have to surrender? Possibly none. You might actually fight longer if you believe that you may be put in prison once this is over. So, an institution designed to reduce atrocities could, in fact, under some circumstances, make a conflict harder and even longer. International policies is full of these kinds of unintended consequences. There are other ways to pursue accountability. One is individual petition. In some systems, individuals can appeal beyond their own government to a supranational court. That's significant because the government is no longer the gatekeeper. Another approach is transitional justice. Imagine a country emerging from a dictatorship or a civil war. What should it do about atrocities committed under the previous government? Put everyone in jail, grant amnesty, create a truth commission, pay reparations, build memorials. Sometimes societies decide that documenting what happened and publicly acknowledging victims is an important part of the rebuilding process. Justice isn't always limited to putting people in prison. Now we reach perhaps the most controversial idea in the chapter, responsibility to protect, or R2P. Traditional sovereignty meant something like this: what happens inside our borders is our business. R2P changes the logic. It says sovereignty also carries responsibility. A government has a responsibility to protect the people within its territory, and it completely fails to do so, the international community may have a responsibility to act. That sounds straightforward until we ask who gets to decide. Libya in 2011 became a major test. Syria, shortly after, demonstrated the limits. Military intervention requires political agreement, particularly through the UN Security Council, and the permanent members don't always agree. So R2P may exist as a principle without producing consistent action. Refugees create another challenge because they cross international borders. The UDHR recognizes a right to seek asylum from persecution. International refugee law also embraces the principle that refugees should not simply be returned to a country where they face persecution. But look at the scale. More than 120 million people are forcibly displaced. That's an extraordinary number. And here's another important point. Most refugees aren't hosted by the world's wealthiest countries. About three-quarters are hosted by low and middle income countries. So when we discuss refugee policies, don't think about the United States or Western Europe. Countries neighboring conflicts frequently carry much of the larger burden. This map moves us from legal commitments to actual human rights practices. It looks at the freedom of religion. As you examine the map, think about what we're actually trying to measure. Can people choose their religion? Can they change religions? Can they practice publicly and privately? Can they peacefully share their beliefs? And are governments, authorities restricting those activities? Human rights aren't simply abstract philosophical concepts. Political scientists try to measure them, and measuring them can be difficult. Governments accused of abuse aren't always eager to provide accurate information about those abuses. This map focuses on torture. Remember that the prohibition against torture is particularly strong in international human rights law. It is supposedly non derogatable. In other words, governments aren't all allowed to say we are temporarily suspending the prohibition against torture because we are facing an emergency. But here's a question worth thinking about. If virtually every government says torture is wrong, why does torture continue? This illustrates the difference between strong international norms and consistent compliance with those norms. This map measures another type of freedom, whether women can engage in private political discussions without fear of harassment or punishment. This is interesting because restrictions don't always come directly from written government law. Social norms, customary rules, community pressure, and informal enforcement can restrict people's behavior. That makes measurement more complicated. It also reminds us that human security isn't only whether the government puts someone in prison. Freedom can be constrained by many different ways. Now we get to the $1 million question. Does any of this actually work? And the frustrating answer is it's difficult to know. Suppose countries that sign human rights treaties have better human rights records. Great. The treaty works, right? Not necessarily. Maybe countries that respect human rights are simply more likely to sign the treaty. That's the classic problem of selection. Even worse, some governments may sign treaties because they want international legitimacy while continuing abusive practices. So we have to be very careful about claiming the treaties automatically cause better behavior. The optimists offer a more long term argument. Maybe treaties don't transform governments' behavior overnight. Maybe they gradually change the political environment. Human rights institutions give activists a language they can use. People can say, my government agreed that I possess this right. NGOs can publicize violations. Domestic organizations can mobilize. International allies can apply pressure. In that sense, institutions gradually change how people understand their own interests and expectations. The anti apartheid movement in South Africa is an example of how domestic activism and international pressure can reinforce one another. This photograph brings us to transnational advocacy once again. International activists have drawn attention to Chinese treatment of the Uyghur minority. This is also a good example of the limits of international pressure. China is a major economic and military power and a permanent member of the UN Security Council. That makes coercive action extraordinarily difficult. So ask yourself, does international human rights work equally well against powerful countries and weak countries? Probably not. Power still matters. That's what we should never forget when studying institutions. Now, here is an interesting graph. This graph raises an interesting empirical debate. Have human rights actually improved around the world? Traditional measures suggest that fluctuates and limited progress occurs, but newer measures, including one by political scientist Christopher Ferris, suggest more improvement has occurred since the 1980s. Part of the disagreement comes from the measurement. Standards of change have changed. Something that governments could have done in the 1950s might today be identified as a serious human rights violation. So sometimes our measurements make the world appear to be worse, partly because our expectations have become higher. That's an actual interesting sign of normative progress. This may be the most important slide in the chapter. Why is protection inconsistent? Think in terms of costs and benefits. Most people might agree that stopping human rights abuse is good, but who is going to pay for it? Would citizens accept higher taxes, economic sanctions that hurt domestic businesses, sending soldiers into another country, risking a war? The benefits of protecting human rights can be widespread and diffuse, while the costs of enforcement can be immediate and concentrated. States are more likely to act when three things happen. First, there is a strong domestic pressure to do something. Second, action serves a broader national interest. And third, leaders can justify the action as being consistent with international rules concerning sovereignty. This helps explain why international communities respond aggressively in some cases and barely respond in others. So let's finish by returning to where we started. International human rights law is an institution. It establishes rules and expectations about how governments should treat human beings. Those rules have clearly changed international politics. The fact that we can talk about international court prosecuting a former head of state would have been extraordinary in an earlier era. Transnational advocacy networks can expose abuses. International institutions can create accountability. Trade agreements can create incentives. Courts can prosecute individuals, but none of these mechanisms are perfect. Human rights law is not self-enforcing. Someone has to investigate violations, someone has to apply pressure, someone has to impose sanctions, and someone has to be willing to bear the substantial cost. So the major takeaway from this chapter is not that international human rights institutions don't matter. They do matter, but institutions operate within a political world where states have different interests, different levels of power, and different willingness to pay for the cost of enforcement. This is why progress is possible, but protection remains inconsistent. In closing, I want you to think about one final question. If human rights really are universal, should protecting them depend on whether other countries happen to have an interest in doing so? That's a difficult question, and there isn't an easy answer. But it gets at the central problem we've examined throughout this chapter. The conflict between universal principles, state sovereignty, political interests, and the limits of international institutions exists. Keep that question in mind as you complete the assignments for this unit.